The following PPT is on modulation technique. It is presented by Janvi, Vaidehi, Bhavna, and Kunal. Next, the The transmission technique is broadly classified into baseband transmission and modulation transmission. Next, please. The baseband transmission, the electrical equivalent of original information is known as baseband signals. The communication system in which the baseband signals are transmitted is directly known as baseband transmission. Baseline transmission is effective only for wire communication. Examples are telephone network, data communication, in computer networking through coaxial cables. But it is ineffective, inefficient for wireless or radio communication. The ahead PPT is given by Kunal.
Thank you, Vaidhi. Let's see about limitation of baseband transmission. Baseband signal having small frequency range from 20 Hz to 20 kHz only. So no large channel accommodation and mixing of signals. Due to small frequency of range, baseband signal cannot travel long distance in free space. After a travel of small distance, signals get suppressed. It is not used for radio. To make a baseband signal efficient for radio communication, modulation technique is used. In modulation technique, next, Bhavna, please change the slide. In modulation technique, to overcome the drawback of baseband transmission and the transmit baseband signals by radio, modulation technique must be used. Baseband signal is a low frequency signal and cannot travel long distance. Here is the definition of modulation. Modulation is the process of superimposing low frequency information signal on a high frequency carrier signal. Now further PPT will explain by Janvi.
Thank you, Kunal. In this in this diagram, the waveforms are showing the process of modulation. In figure A, we can see a modulating signal which has low frequency. In figure B, we can see a carrier signal which has higher frequency signal. And in figure C, it is been amplitude on the carrier signal which is known as the which this process is known as modulation. Further on, the modulation is classified into two types: amplitude modulation and angle modulation. Angle modulation is further classified as frequency modulation and phase modulation. Modulation technique, we can compare the modulation process as modulationing signal, that is information, that is the person who needs a carrier, that is a car, and modulated signal, when a man sits in a car, becomes a modulated signal. Need of modulation. Baseband signal transmission cannot be used for radio communication. To transmit the baseband signal for radio communication, modulation must be used. Modulation is necessary because of following advantages. First, reduction in height of antenna. Second, avoids mixing of signals. Third, increase the range of communication. Fourth, multiplexing is possible. Fifth, improves the quality of reception. The further PPT will be explained by Bhavna.
Thank you, Janvi. Avoiding binding of signal, basement signal 1, modulation with 3 MHz carrier in channel 3, baseband signal 2 with 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz, modulation with 2 MHz carrier in channel 2, and baseband signal 3, 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz, modulation with 1 MHz carrier in channel 1. Classification of modulation. Modulation can be classified into two: analog modulation and digital modulation. Analog modulation also further classified: amplitude modulation, Angle modulation, pulse analog modulation. Amplitude modulation is classified into four: 3 SBFC, 38BBC, and 88B V8B. Amplitude modulation also further classified into frequency modulation and phase modulation. Pulse analog modulation is also classified into three: pulse amplitude modulation, pulse vertical modulation, and pulse width modulation. Digital modulation is also classified into three: pulse code modulation, delta modulation, adaptive data modulation. Types of AM, FM, and PM definition waveforms. Definition of AM, amplitude modulation, is a technique of modulation in which amplitude of a carrier varies in accordance with amplitude of modulating signals, keeping frequency and phase constant. The waveform is shown below. FM, frequency modulation, is a technique of modulation in which frequency of carrier varies in accordance with amplitude of modulating signals, keeping amplitude and phase constant. PM, phase modulation, is a technique of modulation in which phase of carrier varies in accordance with amplitude of modulating signals, keeping amplitude and frequency constant. And the figure is shown below the waveform of the three types of modulation. Thank you.